This story was submitted by a man we'll call Elias. And it starts in a courtroom. Not at the beginning. In the middle. Because that's where Elias wants you to enter this story, sitting in the third row of a civil courtroom in a mid-sized American city at 10:47 on a Wednesday morning, watching a 61-year-old man in a navy suit dab at his eyes with a folded handkerchief and tell a judge that his own son had lost his mind. The man in the navy suit was Walter, Elias's father. The CEO, on paper, of a family-owned precision manufacturing firm that had been operating for 26 years. A company that employed over 100 people. A company that Elias had spent the last 8 years of his life building into something that actually worked. And Walter was standing in front of a judge, voice cracking at rehearsed intervals, explaining that his son, his only son, had become erratic, paranoid, and psychologically unfit to hold any executive position within the company. He requested that the court issue a temporary restraining order barring Elias from company premises, freeze Elias's equity stake pending a competency review, and appoint Walter as sole decision-maker until the matter was resolved. He brought documentation. 3 letters from board members, all of whom Walter had personally appointed over the years, attesting to Elias's increasingly unstable behavior. A statement from a psychologist, not Elias's psychologist, mind you, but a psychologist retained by Walter's personal attorney, offering a preliminary assessment that Elias exhibited signs of occupational paranoia and delusional fixation. Based on what? Based on a 30-minute phone call with Walter describing his son's behavior. Not an examination. Not a session. A phone call. Elias was sitting 8 feet away during all of this. Perfectly still. Hands flat on the table. Breathing normally. His attorney was next to him, a woman named, we'll say Diane, who specialized in corporate litigation and fiduciary disputes. Elias wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at his watch. Because in approximately 10 minutes, 2 agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit were going to walk into the lobby of Walter's company headquarters 15 miles away and serve a federal search warrant. And Walter didn't know that yet. Let me back this up. The company, we'll call it Prior Manufacturing, because that's not what it's called, made precision machine components. Metal parts. CNC work, multi-axis milling, tolerance-critical components for aerospace subcontractors, medical device companies, and defense-adjacent firms. Not the kind of business that makes headlines. The kind that makes payroll, quietly, for decades. Walter started it in the late 90s. To his credit, the early years were legitimate. He knew the industry. He had relationships with buyers. He secured the first few contracts and built a small shop into a functional operation. But here's what Elias understood about his father long before anyone else did: Walter was a front-of-house man. He could shake hands. He could close a dinner. He could walk a client through the shop floor with his sleeves rolled up, point at machines he didn't fully understand, and make people feel confident. What he could not do, what he had never been able to do, was manage. Walter didn't read financial statements. He didn't track margins. He didn't understand the cost structure of his own product lines. The company survived its first decade not because of Walter's leadership, but because the market was forgiving and the contracts were fat enough to absorb his inefficiencies. Elias entered the picture at 22. Fresh out of college with a degree in industrial engineering and a minor in accounting. He didn't walk into the corner office. He started on the production floor, running a CNC lathe on second shift. Walter insisted on it, said it would build character. What it actually built was Elias's understanding of every square foot of that operation from the ground up. Over 8 years, Elias moved from the floor to shift supervisor, to production manager, to operations director, and finally to chief operating officer. Every promotion was earned. Every step up corresponded to a measurable improvement in the department he left behind. When he took over production scheduling, on-time delivery went from 71% to 94% in 14 months. When he restructured the quoting process, the company's win rate on new contracts increased by 30%. When he renegotiated the raw material supply agreements, he saved the company $400,000 a year. By the time Elias was COO, he was running the company. Full stop. Walter's role had become ceremonial. He showed up for board meetings, 4 times a year. He attended industry dinners. He played in charity golf tournaments, which happened with suspicious frequency, sometimes 3 or 4 a month. He maintained the title of CEO because the title is what Walter cared about. The work was beneath him. The work was Elias's job. And for a while, that arrangement functioned. Not because it was healthy, but because Elias was too busy keeping the machine running to stop and examine the dysfunction. That changed in January of the year this all went sideways. Elias was preparing the company's year-end financials for the external audit. Standard process. He pulled the general ledger, reconciled the operating accounts, reviewed the balance sheet. And he found a hole. Not a rounding error. Not a misclassified expense. A hole. The company set aside money every quarter for tax obligations, federal, state, payroll. This is basic corporate hygiene. You estimate your tax liability, you move the cash into a designated reserve account, and when the bill comes due, you pay it. The tax reserve account should have held approximately $1.2 million, representing the accumulated set-asides for the prior 3 quarters. The account held $86,000. $1.1 million was gone. Elias pulled the transaction records. The money had been moved, not spent from the tax account directly, but transferred out in a series of wire transfers over a 7-month period. The transfers went to an account held by an entity Elias had never seen before, a limited liability company registered in another state. The LLC's name was generic, something like Westbrook Property Holdings. It had no website. No employees. No visible business activity. Elias went to the company's controller, a man named Phil who had been with the firm for 12 years, and asked about the transfers. Phil turned pale. He said Walter had authorized them. He said Walter told him the LLC was a strategic real estate investment the company was making, and that it had been approved by the board. Elias checked with the board. It hadn't been approved. None of the 3 board members, Walter's hand-picked loyalists, mind you, had ever heard of Westbrook Property Holdings. When Elias brought it up, 2 of them looked confused. The 3rd looked nervous. Elias went to his father. And this is where the relationship between them crossed a line it would never come back from. He sat down in Walter's office, the office Walter used maybe 3 days a month, and laid out what he'd found. The missing reserves. The wire transfers. The unknown LLC. He didn't accuse. He asked questions. Calm, specific questions. Where did the money go? What is this entity? Who authorized the transfers outside of board approval? Walter's reaction was immediate and total. He attacked. Not the question. The questioner. He told Elias he was overstepping. He told him the CEO's financial decisions were not subject to COO review. He told him that if Elias continued to dig around in things he didn't understand, it would create problems for him within the company. Elias told me he sat there and watched his father's face as he said all of this, and he recognized something he'd seen before but never fully named. Walter wasn't angry. He was scared. The aggression was a perimeter defense. The volume was a distraction. And the threat, create problems for you, was a preview. Elias left that office and did something his father didn't expect. He stopped asking questions. Out loud. He stopped asking questions out loud. What he did instead, quietly, methodically, over the next 4 months, was build a case. Elias hired a forensic accountant. Not through the company. Privately. Out of his own pocket. A woman named, we'll call her Nadia, who had spent 15 years at one of the big 4 accounting firms before going independent, specializing in fraud examination and financial forensics. Nadia cost $1,200 a day. Elias paid it. He gave her access to everything he could legally obtain as COO, general ledger exports, bank statements for the company's operating accounts, accounts payable records, tax filings, board minutes. He did not access Walter's personal files or personal accounts. That would have been a legal problem. He didn't need to. The trail was in the company's own records, because Walter hadn't been careful enough to hide it properly. He'd been sloppy. The way people get sloppy when they've never been questioned. Here's what Nadia found. The LLC, Westbrook Property Holdings, was registered in Delaware. Its registered agent was a legal services firm that specialized in anonymous entity formation. But the LLC's operating agreement, which Nadia obtained through a public records request in the state where the LLC held real property, listed a managing member, a woman. We'll call her Renee. Renee was not an employee of Prior Manufacturing. She was not a vendor. She was not a consultant. She was not a family member. She was, based on what Nadia was able to determine through property records, social media footprint, and public court filings from a prior civil matter, a woman Walter had been in a relationship with for approximately 5 years. The LLC owned one asset, a condominium. Not a modest one. A 2-bedroom penthouse unit in a mid-rise luxury building in a city about 3 hours from where Walter lived with Elias's mother. Purchase price, $875,000. The purchase had been funded almost entirely by wire transfers from Prior Manufacturing's tax reserve account. Walter had taken the money the company set aside to pay the IRS, money held in trust for a federal tax obligation, and used it to buy an apartment for a woman he was sleeping with. And there was more. The monthly carrying costs on the unit, HOA fees, utilities, a leased Mercedes registered to the LLC, were also being paid through the company. Not directly. The payments were routed through a series of expense reimbursements coded as consulting fees to a second LLC, also controlled by Renee, that had never performed any actual consulting work. Nadia traced over $340,000 in additional disbursements through this channel over a 2-year period. Total exposure, approximately $1.5 million. Taken from a company that employed over 100 people. Taken from a tax reserve account, meaning the IRS had not been fully paid. Meaning the company was carrying an undisclosed federal tax liability that, if discovered, would trigger penalties, interest, and potential criminal referral. This wasn't just fraud. This was tax evasion executed through corporate embezzlement. And it crossed state lines. The LLC was in one state, the company in another, the bank accounts in a third. That made it federal. Elias sat on this for 2 months. Not because he was hesitating. Because he was sequencing. He understood something about his father that most people in his position don't think clearly enough to grasp. Walter would not go quietly. Walter would not see the evidence and resign. Walter would fight. And Walter's first move, the move he always made when cornered, would be to discredit the person confronting him. So Elias prepared for that. He went to his personal physician, his actual doctor, a man who had treated him for years, and requested a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Not because he thought he was unstable. Because he knew his father would claim he was. He completed a full battery of cognitive and psychological assessments. The results were unremarkable. No pathology. No impairment. The psychologist's written summary described Elias as organized, methodical, and emotionally regulated. He filed that report with Diane, his attorney, and told her to keep it ready. Then he contacted the IRS. And then he contacted the FBI. And here, right here, I want to pause. If your own flesh and blood tried to put you in a mental institution, tried to have you declared incompetent, not because you were sick, but because you found out what they were stealing, would you show mercy? Would you pull the punch? Subscribe if you're letting the law take its course. And I'll tell you exactly what happened when the gavel came down. Walter struck first. Just like Elias predicted. Within 72 hours of Elias formally notifying the board, in writing, through counsel, that he had identified material financial irregularities requiring independent investigation, Walter filed a civil petition. The petition sought three things. 1. A temporary restraining order barring Elias from all company systems, accounts, and premises. 2. A freeze on Elias's equity interest in the company pending a fitness review. 3. Appointment of Walter as sole fiduciary and decision-maker during the review period. The grounds? Elias was psychologically unfit, erratic, exhibiting paranoid ideation and delusional beliefs about company finances, a danger to the company and, implicitly, to himself. Walter's attorney, a man from a white shoe firm downtown, billing at rates that were themselves being paid with company funds, filed the petition with supporting declarations from 3 board members and the phone call psychologist I mentioned earlier. The one who had never met Elias. The one who diagnosed occupational paranoia, based on a 20-minute conversation with the subject's father. The hearing was scheduled on an expedited basis. Walter's attorney argued urgency. The unstable COO had access to sensitive systems and could cause irreparable harm. And that brings us back to the courtroom. Wednesday morning, 10:47. Walter was on the stand. He was performing. And I use that word deliberately, because what Elias described to me was not testimony, it was theater. Walter spoke in a low, trembling voice. He paused at strategic moments. He referred to Elias as, "my boy," 3 times. He told the judge he'd never wanted it to come to this. He described Elias's behavior as, increasingly alarming, staying late at the office, obsessively reviewing financial records, becoming withdrawn and secretive. He said he feared for Elias's mental health. He said he tried to intervene, as a father, but that Elias had pushed him away. He dabbed his eyes. The handkerchief was monogrammed. Elias sat still through all of it. He told me the hardest part wasn't hearing the lies. The hardest part was watching the judge's face and seeing that it was working. Walter was convincing. He was polished. He had decades of practice being the charming man in the room, and he was deploying every tool he had. Diane leaned over at one point and whispered, "He's good." Elias whispered back, "He's about to be done." When it was Elias's turn, Diane didn't start with emotion. She started with paper. She entered into evidence the results of Elias's independent psychological evaluation, the full battery, administered by a licensed clinical psychologist over 2 sessions, completed 3 months prior. Clean. No impairment. No pathology. She contrasted it with the phone call assessment Walter had submitted, and asked the court to note that the psychologist who authored Walter's report had never examined, interviewed, or even met the subject of his assessment. The judge's expression shifted. Not dramatically. But it shifted. Then Diane introduced Elias's employment record. 8 years. Every performance review. Every operational improvement tied to his leadership. Revenue growth charts. Client retention data. The on-time delivery numbers. The margin improvements. She built a portrait of a man who was not erratic, who was, by every measurable standard, the most competent person in the building. And then she said, "Your Honor, my client is not here to defend his sanity. He is here to present evidence of why his sanity was attacked." Diane entered the forensic audit into evidence. All of it. Nadia's full report. 114 pages. Every wire transfer. Every fake consulting invoice. Every payment to the second LLC. The property records for the Penthouse. The operating agreement listing Renee as managing member. The Mercedes lease. The HOA payments. The utility bills. $1.5 million. Exposed. Line by line. Dollar by dollar. Month by month. She presented the tax reserve account ledger showing the systematic depletion of funds designated for federal tax obligations. She presented the company's filed tax returns alongside its actual payment records, demonstrating a discrepancy of over $1.1 million in unpaid federal taxes, taxes the company had reported as paid but had, in fact, diverted. She presented the corporate bylaws, which explicitly required board approval for any disbursement over $50,000 and any formation of subsidiary entities. Neither approval had been sought or granted. And then she said the sentence that Elias told me landed in the courtroom like a brick on a glass table. Your Honor, the petitioner is not seeking to protect this company from an unstable officer. The petitioner is seeking to remove the only person in the company who discovered that the petitioner has been embezzling corporate funds to finance a secret personal relationship, and evading federal taxes in the process. Walter's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Walter's face did something Elias described as mechanical failure. The performance stopped. The trembling voice stopped. The concerned father stopped. What was left was a man sitting in a witness chair with his mouth slightly open, looking at his own attorney, waiting to be rescued. His attorney asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. During the recess, Diane told the judge, in chambers, with both attorneys present, that the matter had been referred to federal authorities. She did not elaborate. She didn't need to. She was putting on the record that this was no longer just a civil dispute between family members over corporate control. This was a matter the federal government was now aware of. When court resumed, Walter's attorney made a motion to withdraw the original petition. The judge asked Walter directly, on the record, if he wished to withdraw his claims regarding Elias's fitness. Walter said yes. Quietly. Without looking at his son. The judge denied the restraining order. Denied the equity freeze. And stated, on the record, that based on the evidence presented, the court had serious concerns about the petitioner's fiduciary conduct, and would be referring the matter to the state attorney general's office for potential corporate fraud investigation, independent of any federal proceedings. Now. Remember the watch. Elias checking his watch at 10:47. At 11:02 that morning, while Walter was still mid-performance on the witness stand, 2 FBI agents from the Financial Crimes Unit arrived at the headquarters of Prior Manufacturing with a federal search warrant. They seized the company's financial servers. They seized Walter's office computer. They seized the physical files from the controller's office. Phil, the controller, was interviewed on site for 3 hours. Elias didn't know the exact minute it happened. But he'd coordinated the timing with the federal agent handling the case. The hearing and the search warrant were scheduled for the same morning. Deliberately. So that Walter would be in a courtroom, under oath, performing his concerned father routine, while federal agents were pulling the evidence from his own building. Elias told me he didn't feel satisfaction in that moment. He said it felt like watching a structure come down, not with an explosion, but with the quiet withdrawal of the supports that had been holding it up for years. Walter was indicted 5 months later. Federal charges. Wire fraud. Tax evasion. Money laundering, because the use of shell LLCs to move embezzled funds across state lines met the statutory threshold. The indictment named Rene as an unindicted co-conspirator. He took a plea. His attorney negotiated it down from a potential 12-year exposure to 34 months in a federal minimum security facility, plus full restitution to the company and back payment of all outstanding tax liabilities with penalties and interest. The Penthouse was seized as a proceed of fraud. The Mercedes was returned to the leasing company. The LLCs were dissolved. Elias's mother, we'll call her Judith, filed for divorce 30 days after the indictment was made public. She didn't speak to Elias about it directly. He heard through an aunt. He didn't reach out. He told me there was nothing to say that the paperwork wouldn't say better. The board resigned. All 3 members. Quietly, and without public statements, on the advice of their own attorneys, who presumably explained to them that their failure to exercise oversight, their fiduciary duty, over the company's finances left them personally exposed to shareholder derivative claims. The court appointed Elias as receiver of the company during the restructuring period. Within 60 days, he had retained a new controller, engaged a legitimate CPA firm for a full re-audit, negotiated a payment plan with the IRS for the outstanding tax liability, and stabilized the company's operations. He kept every employee. All 112 of them. Not one layoff. He told me that was the first decision he made, and it was non-negotiable. Within a year, the company was operating at a profit again. Within 2 years, it had paid off the IRS liability in full, including penalties, and was generating margins higher than any point in its history. Elias is still the CEO. He dropped the interim and the receiver labels 18 months in, when the court formally transferred full control back to him. He restructured the board with independent members, people who had no personal relationship with him and no incentive to look the other way. He runs the company the way he always ran operations, precise, measured, and documented. Every disbursement over $10,000 requires dual authorization. Every tax set-aside is held in a segregated account with quarterly third-party verification. Every board meeting has minutes, every decision has a paper trail, and every dollar has a name attached to it. He doesn't visit Walter. He doesn't write. He doesn't take calls. Someone asked him once, a mutual acquaintance, trying to broker some kind of reconciliation, if he'd ever consider letting his father back into the business after he served his time. Elias said no. And when the person asked why, Elias said something that I think is the cleanest summary of this entire story. He said, he didn't just steal money. He tried to have me erased to cover it. You don't come back from that. Not with me. Here's the thing about people like Walter. They don't fear consequences. They fear discovery. The entire architecture of what he did, the shell companies, the coded invoices, the fake consulting fees, wasn't built to withstand investigation. It was built to avoid attention. And the moment someone paid attention, the moment his own son sat down with a ledger and a calculator and started asking where the money went, Walter didn't correct course. He didn't come clean. He tried to destroy the person asking the questions. He weaponized the word unstable against the most stable person in the building. And that's the part of this story that stays with me. Not the money. Not the mistress. Not the penthouse. The fact that a father looked at his son, a son who had spent 8 years carrying the weight of a company that bore his father's name, and decided it was easier to call him crazy than to admit what he'd done. Elias didn't break. He documented. He prepared. He sequenced. And when the time came, he didn't scream. He handed the judge a folder and let the numbers speak. The numbers always speak. You just have to be quiet enough to let them. This has been Christopher. If this one hit close, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.